The metallic tang of her own blood was the first thing she tasted when she woke. Not the dust of the Arizona Territory, not the stale water in the canteen, but the iron-rich proof of her body tearing itself apart. The cry that pierced the silence wasn't her own. It was smaller, more desperate a sound that tethered her to a world she was ready to let go of. Her late husband's brother, the man who had promised her sanctuary, was gone. The wagon, the supplies, her meager inheritance, all vanished. He had left her in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains, still bleeding from the birth of a child he considered a burden, a final, cruel act in a land that had already taken everything. The world swam back into focus, in jagged, painful shards of light. Clementine May Stokes knew the precise moment her life had truly ended, and it wasn't when the doctor in Tucson had shaken his head over her husband's fever 3 weeks prior. It was now in the suffocating heat of a merciless sun, with the aftershocks of childbirth still racking her insides. Her husband, Jedediah, had been a good man. Strong kind, with a belief in the promise of the West that bordered on religious fervor. He saw fertile valleys where others saw sun-scorched rock. He'd bought a plot of land site unseen from a land agent in St. Louis, a place he called Promise Creek. It was to be their Eden. But Jedediah's promises had died with him, his body succumbing to a waterborne sickness that paid no mind to a man's dreams. That left Simon, Jedediah's younger brother. Simon Stokes was carved from a different, harder stone. Where Jedediah's eyes held the warmth of a hearth, Simon's were chips of cold slate. He'd arrived in Tucson a week after the funeral, all solemn condolences and firm handshakes, promising to see Clementine and her unborn child safely to the new homestead. It's what Jed would have wanted, Clementine. He'd said, his voice a low, convincing rumble. Family sticks together. Family. The word was a bitter poison on her tongue now. The birth had come on fast, 2 days out from Tucson. A brutal, agonizing affair inside the cramped rocking wagon with only Simon's impatient grunts for assistance. He'd boiled water because he was told to, but his disgust was plain. When the baby, a tiny wailing girl, finally entered the world, Simon had wrapped her in a spare horse blanket with the same enthusiasm a man might show for handling a snake. Clementine had been too exhausted, too submerged in a fog of pain to notice his growing agitation. She remembered him rummaging through Jedediah's lockbox. She'd assumed he was looking for jerky or coffee. Just resting my eyes, she had murmured, the world already beginning to tilt. You do that, Simon had replied, his voice strangely tight. The next time she opened them, she was on the ground. The wagon was gone. The spare horse, gone. The lockbox, which held their life savings, and the deed to Promise Creek was gone. Even the extra canteen of water was gone. He had taken everything. He had left her with 2 things. The blood that was still seeping through her torn calico dress, staining the thirsty earth, a dark, ugly rust, and the squirming, red-faced infant now beginning to cry in earnest. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the haze of pain. She tried to sit up, but a fresh wave of agony shot through her lower body, and she collapsed back with a groan. The baby's cries grew louder, more insistent. It was a cry of hunger, of life demanding to be sustained. Clementine forced herself onto her side, ignoring the tearing sensation inside her. She pulled the bundled infant to her chest. The baby's face was a mess of wrinkles and fury, her tiny mouth rooting blindly. Clementine fumbled with the buttons of her dress, her fingers clumsy and weak. The baby latched on with a desperate strength that belied her size. As the child drank, Clementine scanned the horizon. Nothing. Just endless plains of scrub brush, skeletal ocotillo, and the distant hazy purple of the mountains. The sun was a hammer, beating down without mercy. They were miles from any known trail. Simon hadn't just abandoned them. He had executed them with heat and dehydration. A guttural sob escaped her, a sound of pure animal despair. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She was a tombstone waiting for a name, and she had brought a new life into this God-forsaken end. The irony was so cruel it was almost a physical blow. She pressed the baby closer, her small, warm body a fragile anchor in a sea of desolation. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the child, the words cracking in her dry throat. "Oh, my sweet girl, I am so sorry." She lay there for what felt like an eternity, the sun creeping across the sky, the shadows of the saguaros lengthening like accusing fingers. Her strength was failing. The bleeding, though slower now, was a constant, draining reminder of her body's trauma. Thirst was a living creature clawing at her throat. Soon the baby would need more from her than she could give. Soon the crying would stop. And then a new sound, the soft scuff of a footstep on gravel. Clementine's head snapped up, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Was it Simon? Had he come back? Had he grown a conscience? But the figure that emerged from behind a cluster of granite boulders was not Simon. He was tall and lean, with skin the color of burnished copper. His black hair was long held back by a simple leather band. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, and he carried himself with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed a part of the landscape itself. His face was stark, with high cheekbones and dark, unreadable eyes that took in the scene with unnerving stillness. An Apache, every horror story she had ever heard crashed down on her at once. Scalpings, raids, women stolen. Her hand instinctively tightened around her baby. This was it. This was the end, just a different, more violent version than the one Simon had planned. The man's eyes moved from her blood-soaked dress to the infant at her breast, and for a fleeting moment, something shifted in his expression. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to recognition. He took a slow step forward. Clementine flinched, dragging herself backward, the movement sending another searing bolt of pain through her. "Stay back," she croaked the words barely a whisper. He stopped. He held up one empty hand, a gesture of peace that seemed utterly at odds with the terror she'd been taught to feel. He said nothing, simply watched her, his gaze steady. He was alone. No war party. No other warriors hiding in the rocks. He seemed as solitary as she was. Minutes stretched into a silent, sun-baked standoff. The baby finished nursing began to fuss again. The man's eyes flickered to the child. He took another step, then knelt, his movements fluid and unhurried. He unslung a water skin from his shoulder and held it out. Clementine stared at it, then at him. It was a trick. It had to be. A moment of kindness before the inevitable brutality. Yet her throat was so dry, it felt like it was coated in sand. Her baby's life and her own depended on that water. Her survival instinct, a primal force she didn't know she possessed, warred with a lifetime of ingrained fear. She looked from the water to his face. His eyes were not cruel. They were weary, deeply weary. There was a loneliness in them that she recognized, a reflection of the gaping void in her own soul. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out a trembling hand. He didn't move closer. He simply set the water skin on the ground between them and slid it forward. Her fingers closed around the cool, damp leather. She uncorked it and drank the water, so precious it felt like a sacrament. She let it soothe her raw throat before giving a few drops to the baby, who quieted immediately. When she looked up, the man was still there, watching. He spoke, and his voice was low, softer than she expected, with a slight accent she couldn't place. "He left you?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. He had understood the whole pathetic scene in a single glance. Clementine could only nod tears, finally blurring her vision. The man's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. He looked at her, truly, looked at her not as a white woman, not as an intruder, but as a fellow creature in pain. He saw the blood, the fear, the fierce, protective curl of her body around her child. He saw a survivor, teetering on the edge of extinction. He rose to his feet, a silhouette against the setting sun. For a moment, she thought he would leave, that this small act of mercy was all he had to offer. But he turned back, his dark eyes meeting hers across the growing twilight. "The Chiricahua call this place the Land of Standing Stones," he said, his voice carrying on the cooling air. "It is not a place for a mother and a newborn to die. You will come with me." Clementine shook her head, a reflexive gesture of fear. I can't." He seemed to understand her hesitation. He knew the stories the white people told about his people. He knew the fear he inspired just by existing. He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the old scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He knelt once more, his gaze unwavering. "My name is Taza," he said. The name meant nothing to her, but he said it as if it should. "And my people were taken from me in a place not far from here. I know what it is to be left with nothing." He paused, his eyes flicking again to the baby in her arms. "You're safe with me." The words hung in the air, a promise so profound and too unlikely that Clementine's mind struggled to accept it. Safety was a concept that had evaporated with Jedediah's last breath. Trust was a currency Simon had stolen and debased, and yet this stranger, a man who should have been her greatest fear, offered both. Taza didn't wait for an answer. He saw the exhaustion that had hollowed out her eyes, the tremor in her hands. He turned and gathered a pile of dry mesquite branches, and with a skill that was both efficient and mesmerizing, had a small controlled fire crackling to life as the last vestiges of sunlight bled from the sky. The warmth was a balm against the sudden desert chill. He then disappeared into the rocks, returning minutes later with a bundle of leaves and roots she didn't recognize. He crushed them between two stones, mixing them with a little water from his skin until they formed a dark, pungent paste. He approached her cautiously, as one might approach a wounded animal. "This will help the bleeding," he said, holding out the poultice. Clementine recoiled. "What is it?" "Ocotillo root and creosote," he answered simply. "An old remedy. It will clean the wound and help your body close itself." Her mind screamed at her to refuse, to let a savage apply his strange medicine to the most intimate parts of her broken body was unthinkable. But the dull, persistent ache between her legs and the knowledge of the life seeping out of her was a more powerful argument. She was dying. Slowly but certainly. She gave a weak, almost imperceptible nod. There was no shame or leering in his actions. He was as detached and professional as any doctor she could have imagined. He averted his eyes respectfully, guiding her with quiet instructions to apply the poultice herself. The paste stung, at first a clean, sharp fire that made her gasp, but it was quickly replaced by a soothing, numbing coolness. For the first time in what felt like days, the relentless pain began to recede to a manageable level. He then offered her food strips of dried meat, tougher than any jerky she had ever eaten, but full of a smoky, savory flavor that reawakened her ravenous hunger. As she ate, Taza sat by the fire, sharpening the edge of a hunting knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was a strangely comforting sound in the vast, intimidating silence of the desert night. The baby nestled in the crook of Clementine's arm was quiet. The small fire cast dancing shadows on Tarza's face, revealing lines of hardship and grief that the harsh sunlight had hidden. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps not much older than her own 22 years. But his eyes held the ancient weariness of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice raspy. "Why are you helping me?" Tarza didn't look up from his knife. "My wife gave birth to our son in the winter," he said, his voice low and even. "The soldiers came a week later. They called it the Camp Grant Massacre. To them it was a victory. To me it was the day the world burned." He paused, the scraping sound stopping. He looked into the fire, but Clementine knew he was seeing something else entirely. They did not leave her bleeding. They left her still. Both of them. The confession was delivered without a trace of self-pity, a simple, brutal statement of his history. It struck Clementine with the force of a physical blow. Her own tragedy, which had felt so immense and all-consuming, was suddenly placed beside a grief so profound it was almost unimaginable. She at least still had her child. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words utterly inadequate. He looked at her, then his dark eyes meeting hers across the flames. "There is too much sorrow in this land," he said. "Adding to it helps no one. The spirits of my ancestors would not forgive me if I left a mother and child to the coyotes." He fell silent after that, and Clementine didn't press him further. She understood now. He wasn't helping a white woman. He was honoring the ghosts of a wife and son he could no longer protect. In her he saw a chance to perform an act of mercy he had been denied when it mattered most. As the moon climbed high into the inky sky, Tarza stood. "We cannot stay here. Your trail is easy to follow." The thought of Simon sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. He won't come back. He left us to die." "Men like that are greedy," Tarza stated, his tone certain. "Greed makes them careless, but it also makes them persistent." He took a lockbox. Clementine blinked, surprised. "Yes. How did you know?" "The tracks. The wagon was heavy, then it was light. He did not travel far before he stopped and searched it. He was looking for something specific. If he does not find it, he may think you still have it. The deed. The deed to Promise Creek." Jedediah had kept it in a false bottom of the box, but Simon knew all of Jedediah's secrets. He would have found it. Unless... A frantic thought sparked in her mind. On their last night in Tucson, Jedediah, weakened by his fever, but still plagued by a sense of unease about Simon, had made her do something strange. He'd made her take the deed from the box and sew it into the lining of the baby's swaddling blanket. "Just until we're settled," he'd coughed, "a man shouldn't tempt his kin." She had thought it was the fever talking. Now she realized it had been a moment of perfect prophetic clarity. She looked down at the sleeping infant in her arms. The blanket was coarse, simple wool, but it was now the most valuable thing she owned in the world. Tarza was right. If Simon opened that box and found only their savings, he would tear the wagon apart looking for the deed. When he didn't find it, he would realize there was only one other place it could be. He would come back for it. "We have to go," she said, a new urgency in her voice. Tarza nodded. He extinguished the fire, scattering the ashes until no trace remained. He then came to her, and with a startling gentleness, lifted her into his arms. She was too weak to protest, too weak even to feel embarrassed. She weighed next to nothing. He carried her as if she were a child, his movements sure-footed and silent as he navigated the rocky moonlit terrain. The baby remained nestled against her chest, her daughter's soft breaths a steady rhythm against her own frantic heartbeat. They walked for hours deeper into the labyrinth of canyons and ravines that formed the foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains. Taza moved with an effortless intimacy with the land, a land that had been utterly hostile and alien to Clementine just hours before. Under his guidance, it became a sanctuary. Finally, they arrived at a place that was invisible from any distance. A shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of desert willow and a jumble of massive boulders overlooked a small, spring-fed pool of crystal-clear water. It was a secret, perfect place. He gently set her down on a bed of soft furs inside the cave. "You will rest here," he commanded softly. "You will heal. Then we will decide what comes next." Clementine looked around the small shelter. It was sparse, the dwelling of a man with few possessions, but it was safe. She looked at Taza, this man, who was her enemy by every standard she had ever known, and saw only a protector. She had lost a husband, a brother-in-law, and a home. But in the deepest pit of her despair, in the heart of the unforgiving desert, she had found an unlikely savior. As she finally surrendered to a deep, healing sleep, lulled by the sound of the bubbling spring, she allowed a fragile sliver of hope to take root in her wounded heart. Perhaps this wasn't the end. Perhaps this was a different, terrifying and altogether unexpected beginning. The days that followed blurred into a routine of healing and quiet observation. Taza's cave was a refuge from the world. During the day, sunlight filtered through the willow branches, painting shifting patterns on the stone walls. At night, the stars were so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch. Taza was a creature of ritual and discipline. He would rise before the sun, disappearing into the wilderness, only to return with something to sustain them, a rabbit, a handful of edible roots or water from the spring. He showed Clementine how to grind mesquite beans into a coarse, nutty flour and bake it into small, dense cakes on a hot, flat stone. He brought her different herbs for her tea, one to enrich her milk for the baby, another to ease the lingering pain in her body. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were deliberate. He taught her the names of the plants and the animals. He called the saguaro hasani and the coyote ban. He explained how to read the clouds for signs of rain and how to find north by observing the lean of the barrel cactus. He was not teaching her trivia. He was giving her the language of survival, the very grammar of the land she had almost died in. In turn, Clementine found her own voice again. At first, she spoke of the mundane of her childhood in Missouri, of her father's farm, of the rhythms of a life that now seemed to belong to someone else. But as her body healed, so too did some part of her spirit. She found herself telling him about Jedediah, about his dreams for Promise Creek, his infectious optimism, and his fatal underestimation of his own brother's darkness. Taza would listen, his face impassive, but his eyes attentive. He never offered judgment or platitudes, only the quiet respect of his presence. He seemed to understand that speaking the grief aloud was its own form of medicine. The baby grew stronger each day. She was a quiet, watchful infant, with a tuft of dark hair and Jedediah's deep blue eyes. Clementine had yet to name her. To name her felt too permanent, too hopeful, for a world that had proven so treacherous. She was simply the baby, a fragile fact of her existence. One afternoon, as Clementine sat by the spring, bathing the infant in the cool water, Taza approached. He sat on a nearby rock, watching them. "She needs a name," he said. It was not a suggestion. "I know," Clementine replied, her voice soft. I don't know what to call her. Any name I think of seems too fancy, too fragile for this place." "A name has power," Taza said. It tells a spirit where it belongs. My son's name was Goyathle. It means one who yawns. He was always tired. A rare, faint smile touched his lips for a moment before vanishing. But his name meant he was ours. He belonged to us, and to the people. Clementine looked down at her daughter, who was staring up at the sky, her tiny hands balled into fists. What did this child belong to? She was born of a Missouri farmer's daughter, and a dreamer born in a wagon and abandoned in the dirt. Her only legacy was a deed sewn into her blanket and a mother who had nearly failed her in her first hours of life. When I thought we were going to die out there, Clementine said, her voice thick with emotion, the only thing I prayed for was that she would live, that she would have a chance. That was my only hope. The word hung in the air. Hope. It was everything she had lost and everything this child now represented. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't fragile. It was fierce and stubborn. It was the mesquite tree drawing water from deep in the earth. It was the tiny flower blooming from a crack in a sun-baked rock. Hope, she whispered, testing the sound of it. She looked at her daughter. Her name is Hope. Taza nodded slowly, a look of profound approval in his eyes. It is a good name, he said, a strong name. Hope Stokes. The sound of her husband's surname felt strange, now a relic from another life. But it was her daughter's name, a link to the good man who had been her father. That evening, a sense of peace settled over Clementine for the first time. By giving her daughter a name, she had claimed a future. She had drawn a line in the sand, declaring that they would not be defined by Simon's betrayal, but by their own will to survive. She and Hope Stokes belonged to each other, and for now that was enough. But their fragile sanctuary was not impervious. A week later, Taza returned from a scouting trip, his face grim. The usual quiet confidence in his posture was gone, replaced by a tense watchfulness. What is it? Clementine asked, her heart beginning to pound. He is in the town, Taza said. The one they call Redemption Gulch. I followed his tracks. He sold your wagon and horse to the liveryman, a man named Patterson. He is telling people his story. His story. He tells them his poor, widowed sister-in-law, sick with grief and fever, wandered off into the desert with her newborn. He says he has been searching for you for weeks. He is the victim, the worried family man. Taza's lip curled in a silent snarl of contempt. The white folk, they believe him. They offer him whiskey and sympathy. Clementine felt the blood drain from her face. Simon wasn't just a thief. He was a performer. He was weaving a narrative that would make him a hero, and her a madwoman. If she were ever found, who would they believe, a distraught but respectable man or a wild-eyed woman who had been living with an Apache? She knew the answer. The lockbox, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Did he? It was found broken open and discarded, a mile from where he left you, Taza confirmed. He is looking for something he did not find, the land deed. He believes you took it and ran. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Simon had established a public identity as the grieving, concerned relative. Now he could hunt for her, openly enlisting help under the guise of a rescue mission. He wasn't just looking for a piece of paper anymore. He was hunting her. She was the only one who could expose his lies, the only witness to his crime. He couldn't afford to let her and Hope live. The hidden cave, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The world was shrinking, and Simon Stokes was drawing the circle tighter and tighter around them. The peace they had found was just a borrowed moment, and the time had come to pay it back in fear. Redemption Gulch was less a town and more an open wound on the landscape. A single dusty main street was flanked by a dozen wooden buildings, all of them looking sun-bleached and weary, a saloon with lopsided bat-wing doors, a general store, a blacksmith, an assayer's office, and a sheriff's office that was little more than a shack with bars on one window. It was a place for men chasing rumors of silver and for those running from something back east. It smelled of dust manure and cheap whiskey. Simon Stokes felt right at home. He sat at a rough-hewn table in the saloon, a glass of rye in his hand, patiently cultivating his persona. For 2 weeks he had been the picture of familial grief. He'd tacked up a hand-drawn picture of Clementine, a flattering one, making her look doe-eyed and frail, with a notice offering a $20 reward for any information. He spoke to Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut hung over his gun belt, spinning a tale of his sister-in-law's postpartum delirium. Her mind just snapped, Sheriff. Simon said, his voice laced with practiced sorrow. Grief over my brother Jedediah. The hardship of the trail, it was too much. She just started babbling about devils in the rocks and ran off with the babe before I could stop her. Sheriff Brody, a man who preferred simple explanations for complex problems, nodded sympathetically. A terrible business, Mr. Stokes. A woman's mind is a delicate thing. We'll keep our eyes peeled. But Simon wasn't relying on the law. He was relying on the greed of other men. He let it be known in quiet conversations over cards and whiskey that Clementine might be carrying something of value. My brother's papers, he'd say vaguely. Deed to a piece of land. She probably doesn't even know what it is, poor thing. Thinks it's just a letter from home. He'd found the perfect allies in a pair of brothers, Walt and Earl Pembroke. They were hard, vicious men who had been run out of Texas for cattle rustling and had found that their skills were just as applicable to claim jumping in Arizona. They were precisely the kind of men who understood that a deed was worth more than a $20 reward, especially if the owner was a crazy woman who wouldn't be missed. You find her, Simon told them in a low voice in the alley behind the saloon, and the reward is yours, plus a bonus. Just bring her and the baby to me, and the blanket she's wrapped in. I'll handle the rest. Walt, the elder and smarter of the two, narrowed his eyes. Just the blanket. What's so special about a blanket? Sentimental value. Simon lied smoothly. It's the last thing my mother knitted before she passed. It belongs with the family. Walt and Earl exchanged a look. They knew a lie when they heard one, but they didn't care. The lie meant the blanket was worth something, and that was all that mattered. Simon's frustration was a gnawing thing. He had underestimated Clementine. He had assumed the desert would have claimed her within a day. The thought that she was still out there, a living testament to his crime, was a constant irritant. And the deed was everything. Promise Creek wasn't just some random plot of land. An old prospector in his debt from a card game had told Jedediah the secret the creek on that land ran year-round, fed by a hidden aquifer. In the Arizona Territory, a permanent source of water wasn't just valuable. It was a kingdom. With that deed, Simon could control every ranch and mining operation for 50 miles. He could become a king. His performance in Redemption Gulch had served a dual purpose. It provided him with an alibi and a network of eyes. Every prospector, hunter, and traveler who passed through knew the story of the lost woman and child. He had turned the entire territory into a search party. His break came from an unexpected source. An old trapper named Peterson came into town, his mule laden with pelts. He was a man who noticed things others missed. Saw something queer up in the foothills of the Chiricahuas, he mentioned to the bartender, who promptly fetched Simon. "What did you see?" Simon asked, sliding a coin across the bar for a bottle of whiskey for the old man. Peterson took a long swallow before speaking. Tracks, a woman's boot print small, and moccasin prints alongside 'em, and Apaches by the look of the stitching. Simon's blood ran cold. An Apache. He had assumed she was alone. This changed everything. It made her more dangerous. A woman alone would be weak, desperate. A woman with an Apache protector would be resourceful, hidden. Could be she was a captive, Sheriff Brody suggested when he heard the news. Exactly. Simon seized on the explanation. He's taken her, my God, the poor girl. We have to get her back. He turned to the Pembroke brothers who were lurking by the door. His eyes were alight with a new, vicious fire. The narrative had shifted perfectly. Clementine wasn't a mad woman anymore. She was a captive, a victim, and he, Simon Stokes, would be her righteous rescuer. No one would question what he did to the Apache. And in the confusion of a rescue, no one would be surprised if the poor, traumatized woman and her sickly infant tragically didn't survive the ordeal. He's heading east of the Standing Stones, Peterson grunted, pointing on a crude map, toward the canyons. No sane man goes there unless he knows the way. We're not sane men, old-timer. Walt Pembroke grinned, showing a row of yellow teeth. We're motivated. Simon threw a heavy pouch of coins on the table. That's your motivation. There's more when you bring me my niece and the family blanket. He watched them ride out their dust, mingling with the setting sun. For the first time in weeks, Simon felt a genuine smile spread across his face. The hunt was on. He had played the town like a fiddle, transforming his own monstrous act into a tale of tragedy and heroism. Clementine could run, but the story he had crafted would run faster, poisoning every well and turning every stranger into a potential enemy. She and her savage protector were utterly, hopelessly alone. For Clementine, the world had shrunk to the size of the hidden cave and the small clearing around the spring. It was a world of 3 people, a woman, a child, and a man who existed outside the bounds of the society she had known. Her days were measured by the sun's arc across the sky and the steady rhythm of hope's breathing. She grew stronger. The remedies Taza provided had worked. The bleeding had stopped, and her body, though forever changed, was her own again. But Taza's news about Simon had shattered her fragile peace. The knowledge that he was in Redemption Gulch, twisting the truth into a weapon, was a constant low-grade fever in her mind. "We need supplies," she said to Taza one evening, her voice firm. "My milk is enough for Hope now, but soon she will need more. And I need a proper dress, not these rags. We need salt flour, maybe some coffee." Taza looked at her, his expression unreadable. "The town is a place of lies. For you it is dangerous. For me it is death." "I know," she said, her resolve hardening. "That's why I have to go. You've taught me how to be careful, how to move without being seen. I can trade. I have a little money sewn into the hem of my slip. A few dollars Jedediah gave me for emergencies. It was a terrible risk, but the alternative was to remain hidden forever, slowly starving as winter approached. They couldn't live on rabbits and mesquite cakes indefinitely. They needed a stake to move on, to get far away from Simon and this territory. Taza was silent for a long time. He understood her logic, even if he despised the necessity of it. He finally gave a single reluctant nod. "You will not go alone. I will take you to the ridge overlooking the town. I will watch. If there is trouble, you will signal." He handed her a small, polished piece of obsidian. "If the sun is out, flash it twice toward the west peak. If not, find a way to make smoke. I will come." "They'll kill you," she breathed, horrified at the thought of him descending on the town. "They will try," he said, his voice flat. It was the most confident and most terrifying thing she had ever heard him say. 2 days later they made the journey. Taza led her through a network of dry arroyos and game trails, a path that was invisible to the untrained eye. They moved at dawn, arriving at the ridge, as the town below began to stir. From their vantage point, the people looked like ants scurrying along the dusty street. Taza pointed out the livery, the sheriff's office, the general store. "Be quick," he advised. "Get what you need and leave. Speak to no one more than you must. Your face is known." Clementine changed into the cleanest of her tattered clothes, bundling Hope tightly against her chest in a makeshift sling Taza had fashioned from a soft deer hide. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding, and began the descent. Walking into redemption, Gulch felt like stepping onto a stage. Every sound was magnified: the creak of a wagon wheel, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the low murmur of voices from the saloon. She kept her head down, her sunbonnet pulled low to shadow her face. Finity's general store was a dim, cluttered space that smelled of pickles, leather, and dust. An old man with a fringe of white hair and wire-rimmed spectacles stood behind the counter. This was Mr. Finity. Clementine moved quickly, gathering her items: a small bag of flour salt, a sack of beans, and a bolt of sturdy brown cloth. As she placed her goods on the counter, the store owner gave her a curious look. "Haven't seen you round here before, ma'am," he said, his voice friendly enough. "Just passing through," Clementine mumbled, avoiding his eyes. As he was tallying the cost, the store's bell jingled. A woman entered, broad-shouldered and dressed in a severe black dress. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. This was Henrietta Gable, the town's self-appointed moral compass and chief gossip. Mrs. Gable's sharp eyes swept the room and landed on Clementine. They narrowed first at her worn dress, then at the deer-hide sling, holding Hope, and finally at her face, partially obscured by the bonnet. "Good morning, Henrietta," Mr. Finity said. "Is it—" Mrs. Gable replied, her gaze still fixed on Clementine. She took a step closer. "You look familiar, miss. Have we met?" "I don't believe so," Clementine said, her voice tight. She fumbled in her pocket for the coins. Mrs. Gable's eyes flickered down to the baby sling. "That's an unusual carrier. Is that Indian work?" The question was a dart, poisoned and sharp. Clementine could feel the blood draining from her face. "It's practical. I see." Mrs. Gable's lips pursed into a thin, disapproving line. She looked at Clementine's face again, a flicker of recognition dawning in her eyes. It was the face from the poster. The poor, mad woman who had run off. But this woman didn't look mad. She looked scared. "You're the one," Mrs. Gable breathed, her voice a mixture of shock and accusation. "You're Stokes's sister-in-law." Clementine's heart stopped. She dropped the coins on the counter, grabbed her bag of supplies, and turned to flee. "Wait," Mr. Finity called. But it was too late. The bell on the door jingled wildly as Clementine burst back out into the harsh sunlight. Mrs. Gable was right behind her, her voice shrill. "It's her, the lost woman! Somebody get the sheriff! Somebody get Mr. Stokes!" Panic gave Clementine wings. She ran, clutching Hope to her chest, her bag of supplies banging against her hip. She didn't look back. She could hear shouting behind her, the sound of running feet. The entire town was now aware of her. Her lungs burned as she scrambled up the rocky path leading out of town. She risked a glance over her shoulder. Two men, the Pembroke brothers, though she didn't know their names, were following their long legs, eating up the distance. And behind them, emerging from the saloon, was Simon. His face was a mask of theatrical concern, but his eyes, even from this distance, glinted with triumph. He had her. Clementine pushed herself harder, her legs screaming in protest. She reached the ridge, gasping for breath. Taza was there, his face, a grim stone mask. He had seen it all. "They are coming," he said, stating the obvious. "I know," she panted. She fumbled in her pocket for the piece of obsidian, but there was no time for signals. The Pembroke brothers were already halfway up the slope. Taza grabbed her arm. "This way, quickly!" He didn't lead her back the way they came, but along the ridge toward a treacherous-looking spine of rock. It was a path no one would sanely choose, but it was their only choice. As they disappeared into the labyrinth of stone, Clementine looked back one last time. Simon was standing at the base of the ridge, pointing up at them, his mouth open, shouting instructions to the men giving chase. The serpent was out of his hole, and his fangs were bared. The whisper of the world had become a roar, and it was hunting them down. The chase was a desperate, lung-searing marathon. Taza moved with a speed and agility that Clementine, burdened by the baby and her own physical limits, could not match. But he never left her behind. He would surge ahead, scout the path, then double back, taking her hand and pulling her over treacherous ledges or guiding her footing on loose scree. "Don't look down," he commanded, as they navigated a narrow shelf of rock with a sheer drop on one side. "Look at my feet. Step where I step." Hope jostled, and sensing her mother's terror began to wail. Her cries echoed off the canyon walls, a perfect beacon for their pursuers. "Give her to me," Taza said, his voice urgent. Without hesitation, Clementine handed the sling over. Taza secured the baby to his own chest. Hope soothed by the steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat, and the fluid motion of his stride quieted almost immediately. Freed of her precious burden, Clementine could move faster. Behind them, the shouts of the Pembroke brothers grew closer. "There they are, by the split pinnacle!" Walt's voice boomed, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. A chip of rock exploded from the cliff face, inches from Clementine's head, showering her with stinging dust. They were being herded. The Pembrokes knew this terrain well enough to know the paths. They were pushing them toward a dead end. Taza seemed to realize it at the same moment. He stopped abruptly at a fork in the trail. One path led downward into an open, exposed canyon floor. The other led up into a box canyon, a natural trap. "They expect us to go up," Taza said, his mind working with lightning speed. "To trap ourselves. We will do what they do not expect." He veered onto the downward path. It was a gamble. It offered no cover, but it was a direct route toward a dense thicket of cottonwood trees a half-mile distant. If they could make the trees, they would have a chance. They burst out of the narrow trail and onto the canyon floor. They were terrifyingly exposed. Another shot rang out, kicking up dust at their heels. "Run!" Taza yelled. Clementine ran as she had never run in her life, her boots slipping on the loose gravel. Her breath came in ragged, painful sobs. Taza, even with the baby strapped to him, ran with the easy, loping grace of a wolf. A bullet tore through the fleshy part of Taza's left arm. He grunted in pain, but didn't slow. Blood began to soak the sleeve of his buckskin shirt. They were halfway to the trees when Earl Pembroke, faster and more reckless than his brother, appeared on a ridge to their right, cutting off their angle. He dropped to one knee, taking careful aim. There was nowhere left to run. Taza shoved Clementine behind a meager outcrop of rock, shielding her with his own body. He laid Hope still quiet in a small crevice. Then he unslung the rifle he carried on his back, an old but well-maintained Springfield. He had only a few rounds. He would have to make them count. "Stay down," he ordered Clementine. The first shot was not his. It came from Earl Pembroke. The bullet slammed into the rock near Taza's head. Taza didn't flinch. He took a steadying breath, raised his rifle and fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Earl cried out and clutched his leg, his own rifle tumbling down the rocks. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight. Walt Pembroke, seeing his brother fall, let out a roar of rage from his position behind them. He began firing indiscriminately, his bullets ricocheting wildly off the rocks. This was their chance. "Go!" Taza shouted, pushing Clementine toward the cottonwoods now only 100 yards away. "Get to the trees!" Clementine scrambled, half crawling, half running from one rock to another. Taza laid down covering fire, his single shots carefully placed to keep Walt Pembroke pinned down. As Clementine reached the edge of the thicket, she saw a new figure appear at the mouth of the canyon. Simon. He wasn't running. He was walking with a calm, deliberate pace, a pistol in his hand. His face was no longer a mask of concern. It was twisted with a cold, predatory fury. Taza saw him too. He was caught between two fires. Walt Pembroke was still on the ridge behind him, and Simon was advancing from the front. "Clementine." Taza's voice was sharp, a commander's voice. "In my saddlebag, the colt." She looked to where he had tethered his horse, just inside the trees. She ran to the animal, her fingers fumbling with the leather straps of the bag. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth, was a heavy Colt peacemaker. Jedediah had taught her to shoot, but she had never aimed a gun at a man. Her hands shook as she pulled back the hammer. Simon was closing in on Taza's position, using the same rocks for cover that she had. "Give it up, Indian!" he shouted. "Give me the woman and the kid, and I'll let you bleed out in peace. The woman is not yours to take." Taza yelled back, his voice echoing through the canyon. "She's family," Simon sneered, "and this is a family matter." He raised his pistol and fired. Taza, moving to a new position, cried out as a bullet grazed his ribs. He stumbled, his rifle clattering on the ground. He was hit again, and badly. Seeing Taza fall, Simon stood up, a triumphant grin on his face. He began to walk toward the fallen Apache, his pistol aimed at Taza's head. Now, about that deed. This was it. Clementine's world narrowed to the V-shaped sight at the end of the Colt's barrel. This was the man who had left her to die, the man who had murdered her in his heart, and was now about to murder the only person who had shown her kindness. This was not a man. He was a monster. She rested the heavy barrel on the branch of a cottonwood tree to steady her shaking hands. She took a deep breath, just as Jedediah had taught her. She let it out slowly, and she squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand, the explosion shockingly loud. Simon stopped dead. A look of complete surprise washed over his face. He looked down at the blossoming red stain on his shoulder. He staggered, his pistol falling from his suddenly nerveless fingers. He wasn't dead, but the fight was gone from him. From the ridge, Walt Pembroke, seeing his employer shot and his brother wounded, decided the pay wasn't worth his life. He fired one last angry, inaccurate shot before scrambling back the way he came, disappearing from view. Silence descended upon the canyon, broken only by the whimpering of Earl Pembroke and the frantic pounding of Clementine's own heart. She ran from the trees, the Colt still smoking in her hand. Taza was on the ground, propped up on one elbow, his face pale from blood loss. Hope, tucked safely in the crevice, was beginning to stir and cry. Clementine rushed to Taza's side. I will live," he grunted, pressing a hand to his side. "It is a flesh wound." He looked past her toward Simon, who was now on his knees, clutching his shattered shoulder. "You shot him?" "Yes," Clementine said, her voice trembling but clear. Their eyes met. In that moment, something shifted between them. She was no longer just the woman he had rescued. He was no longer just her protector. They were partners. They had fought together. They had bled together. They had survived. She walked over to where Simon knelt, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. She stood over him, the woman he had discarded, like trash now the arbiter of his fate. "It's over, Simon," she said, her voice devoid of hatred. There was only a vast, cold emptiness where her feelings for him used to be. He looked up at her, his eyes wild with pain and frustrated greed. "The deed, Clementine. Just give me the deed." She looked back at Taza, then went to her crying daughter, scooping her up from the crevice. She held Hope close, her fingers touching the coarse wool of the blanket, feeling the stiff parchment sewn within. This was her daughter's birthright. A new beginning. A promise. "You will never have it," she said to Simon. Then she turned her back on him and walked away back toward the man who had told her she was safe and who had helped her find the strength to make that promise true. Vengeance was a luxury they couldn't afford. They looked down at Simon Stokes, a pathetic figure kneeling in the dust, his greed defeated. Killing him would only anchor them to the past. Instead, they took his horse, his pistol, and left him to the mercy of the trail and the town he had deceived. His story, like his shoulder, was shattered, and that was justice enough. The journey back to their hidden cave was a testament to their new reality. Taza, weakened by his wounds, leaned on Clementine for support. The lines between rescuer and rescued had vanished, replaced by the simple, profound truth of partnership. She cleaned and dressed his injuries with a steady hand, nursing him through the haze of pain. In the quiet days of his recovery, their shared silence spoke volumes. They were bound not by words, but by the blood they had spilled and the life they had saved. It was Taza who broke the silence first. "We cannot stay," he said, his voice regaining its strength. "We go to your Promise Creek." They traveled north, leaving the ghosts of the Dragoon Mountains behind them. With each mile, the weight of their ordeal seemed to lessen, replaced by a cautious optimism. After weeks of travel, they crested a ridge and looked down upon a valley so green it stole their breath. A vibrant creek lined with cottonwoods cut a silver path through the land. It was real. It was their future. Clementine slid from her horse, walking with Hope in her arms to the water's edge. She knelt, dipping her hand into the cool, clear stream. This was the place Jedediah had dreamed of, but she would be the one to build a life here. Taza stood beside her, his gaze taking in the sheltered land. "Promise Creek was my husband's name for it," she said softly, "but it feels like it needs a new one, for us." Taza looked from the life-giving water to the child in her arms. "In the language of my people, a name should tell a story," he said. "This place gave us sanctuary when the world offered none. We could call it Safe Harbor Creek." Clementine looked at the peaceful valley, at the steadfast man beside her, and at her daughter Hope. The name settled over her heart, a perfect fit. Safe Harbor Creek. She repeated the words, feeling like a vow. Here they were, no longer a widow and a warrior, but pioneers at the start of a new story, in a place that finally felt like home. The story of Clementine and Taza is more than just a tale of survival in the unforgiving West. It's a powerful testament to the human spirit's ability to find strength in the deepest despair and family in the most unexpected of places. It reminds us that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about acting in spite of it. They were two outcasts, a woman betrayed by her own blood, and a man haunted by the ghosts of his people who found common ground in their shared humanity. Their journey shows that sometimes the lines society draws between us are meaningless in the face of true character and honor. If their story of resilience, courage, and the forging of an unbreakable bond moved you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to let us know you want more stories like this. Share this video with someone who appreciates epic historical drama, and most importantly, subscribe and ring that notification bell. We have many more tales from the heart of the Old West to share with you, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.